2, 1. Yeah. One sec. Just starting up. Hi, our guest today is Professor Karthik Muralidharan, and our topic is how technology is changing what can happen when a child goes to school. So Karthik Muralidharan is an associate professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego, which he joined after his PhD at Harvard. So this particular chat today is driven by a paper by Professor Karthik, Alejandro Ganimian, and Abhijit Singh, which looks at an Indian after-school scheme, and is featured prominently in a special story by The Economist recently. So progress made in language and maths by students in this particular study was greater than in almost any study of education in developing countries. Although The Economist says poor countries, I'm not going to use that term. I'll leave it to Professor Karthik to identify what is what. Professor Karthik, your paper is 82 pages long and very exhaustive. Would you like to begin with your key findings and kind of simplify it for our audience?
Yeah, so I think, the content of the study is that the idea of technology in education has been around for quite some time. A lot of people think that this is going to be transformative, but unfortunately, if you look at the evidence so far, it's actually been pretty weak and mixed. So in particular, one of the very high-profile studies of, say, one laptop per child in Peru, where every child was given a laptop. But a careful randomized evaluation basically found that there was no impact whatsoever of the computer on learning outcomes. There's been studies done in Romania where providing computers to middle school kids actually worsens test scores. So I think the general view on technology is that for most of us who are deeply in the education research literature is that there's a lot of promise, but that there's no guarantee whatsoever that this is going to give you meaningful learning outcomes. And it's all about the details. It's about the details of the extent to which the technology is alleviating constraints to learning. So I think what's nice about this particular study and papers, I mean, to be honest, it's really a reflection of the product, which was developed by an Indian education company called Education Initiatives, and they had developed this over 10 years of iterative product development. And I think, there are 2 or 3 key things about the software, which is the first is that it's based on extensive testing and calibration of a database of over 45,000 questions that's very finely calibrated so that you can match a question to a level of students' understanding. The software itself is completely interactive and adaptive. So, you could be a child in 6th standard, but if your learning level is at the 3rd standard level, it'll give you material at that level. If your learning level is above, it's going to give you material above. So I think, the details of the software are very much designed to cater to the full potential of technology. So it's high quality content, it is customized instruction, it is differentiated feedback so that you're able to use the data to understand exactly where students might be stuck and give them personally differentiated instruction. And it shortens the feedback cycle between attempting a problem and getting feedback on that. So to cut a long story short, what we did in this study was do a high quality randomized evaluation. And for the non-technical viewers, all that means is that instead of looking at a before-after comparison, which could be confounded by other factors, you also have a control group, right? So you have a treatment in a control group where the control group is continuing business as usual. And the only difference in the treatment group is that they got this particular program, okay? And so what you see at the end of just about 4.5 months of the study that was done in middle school grades in Delhi. So the target population of the study was low-income populations going to government schools and being able to access this program in after-school centers. And what you saw within about 4.5 months is very dramatic gains in learning outcomes. That was almost, double the gains of what happened in the control group in math and about 2.5 times as much in language. And I think what's remarkable is not just the size of the effects, but the speed. So, I've been working in education research for over 15 years, and, the size of the effects we find are comparable to the largest effects I have seen in my work in India, except that those gains have come over like 4 or 5 years, and here you saw the gains in about 1/10 of the time. So, I think it for the first time, it just highlights the promise of technology in education. Now, there's a lot more to be done to take this to scale, but as a promising proof of concept, I mean, this was extremely exciting.
Okay, so before we move on, I have some questions based on what all you said, but I want you to explain figure 1 in your study. So I'm going to show that while you go ahead and tell us what those lines mean, and what's the promise that it holds, essentially. Okay, let me bring this up on the screen. So let's see if we can see this. Yeah.
So, so this is the first figure in the paper. And honestly, in my view, this is potentially, the most important figure in developing country education, because what it is showing us is something that many of us have suspected for a long time. But for the first time, you now have real hard data to back this up. So, what this is showing us is that the x-axis shows you the grade that the child is enrolled in, and the y-axis shows you the learning level of the child at that time. So the green line is showing you where the children should be if they were making progress at the same rate of the syllabus. Okay, so if they're keeping track with the curriculum and the textbook, the children should be along that green line. But in practice, where they are is along the red line. Okay, so and each dot you see in that picture is basically one kid in the sample. Okay, so there are 3 big picture messages, and let's just focus on the left-hand side, which is the graph for math, for a moment. So the first is that by the time kids are in grade 6, the average 6th grade kid in a government school in Delhi is already 2.5 grade levels behind where the syllabus and the curriculum is. Okay, so the gap between the red and the green line is about 2.5 standard equivalents. So the average kid in grade 6 is really at a grade 3.5 level. Okay, so that's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is that the gap between where kids are and where the curriculum is steadily growing over time, so that the red line, which is the rate of progress, is flatter than the green line, which is the rate of growth in the curriculum. So by the time you get to class 9, what you see is that the gap between where the average child is and where the syllabus is now up to 4.5 grade levels. Okay, so that's just how big these learning deficits are. And the third point, I mean, so, to be honest, I mean, we're not the first people to say that the learning deficits, Pratham has done its annual ASER studies year after year, showing that kids, 60% of kids or 50% of kids in class 5 can't even do, say, a class 2 problem. I think what's particularly unique about this picture is that because of the computer-aided learning, you can very finely calibrate where every single child is, which then gets to the third point, which is if you look at the sheer variation within a classroom. So if you look at, say, class 8 and look vertically up at that line, you'll see all those little dots, and those dots are telling you where each kid in the sample is. Okay, so what that tells you is at any given point in time in a class 7, in a 7th or 8th grade classroom, you have kids who are all the way at grade 8 level, all the way down to kids at grade 2 level. So you've got a variation in your classroom spanning 6 grade levels. Okay, and I think this is like the fundamental reality of Indian classrooms, which makes instruction so difficult. So, if you look at a lot of the education research in India in the past 15 years, what we find is that the business as usual policies of, spending more money, more infrastructure, paying teachers better, training teachers, none of this seems to have any impact on learning outcomes. And a lot of us who worked in this space for a long time feel that the fundamental issue is that it's not addressing the binding constraint in the classroom, which is that if the instruction, even if you have a highly motivated teacher who's teaching, very sincerely from the textbook and teaching, say, 8th standard math, if the child in the class is at a 3rd or 4th standard level, it doesn't matter what you're doing. I mean, it's not going to get across. Okay, so, and that's why I think that picture is so important, because it just highlights the fundamental challenge of Indian education. Now, the other thing that's useful about the picture is, people in the US who, hear my talks, they'll come and say, wait, but we thought India had the best education system in the world. You produce the best technology graduates. You have the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of Google, so clearly the Indian education system is doing something right. I think the way you reconcile that contradiction between kind of exceptional successes and the crisis you see in average learning is to recognize that the Indian education system historically has been not an education system, but it's been been a filtration system. Okay, so the goal is to identify who is smart as opposed to teach everybody. Okay, so the point about the IITs is that if you have a system that identifies the top 0.01% of a billion-person distribution, I mean, those kids are going to do fantastic things regardless of where you put them. Okay, and in a way, the story of the success of the Indian education system is really a selection story and not a value-added story. And I think, the existential problem for developing country education systems, including India, is that you have massively expanded education access in the past 15 years. You have brought in, tens of millions of kids into a schooling system who are first generation learners who don't have the support at home, or the additional background needed, to keep pace with the curriculum. And then once those kids fall behind, essentially it's over. So, you've got kids who, if at the end of class 3, if you're not functionally literate and numerate, it doesn't matter, whether you're attending school because you're not learning much. And I think the reason that figure is so important, it highlights why the MindSpark and why the software, in my view, has been so much more effective than other interventions we've done. And that's because the software is able to customize the instruction exactly at the level of the child. So essentially, in a class of 40 kids, if you have enormous variation, there's no way a teacher can physically handle that kind of variation. How do I teach simultaneously at 7 different levels? Whereas when you have the software, it's able to completely customize and handle the heterogeneity and variation within the classroom.
Okay, Professor, I have several questions. Okay, now, you have brought up this issue even during your chat with Arvind Subramanian at Berkeley, okay, where you talked about exactly these issues about filtration systems, about how India can produce the IIT, IIM graduates, as well as leave so many people behind. Okay, and then he talks to you about how it's a precocious democracy, precocious politics, precocious economics. So I think those are all realities we have to work with. Now, people like you, who, let's say, you keep saying that a real economist is someone who gets his feet dirty and actually rolls up his sleeves and goes out there and does stuff. So you've done stuff in Andhra Pradesh, which I know about, the cycle scheme. For students.
Sorry, cycle scheme was Bihar.
Bihar, okay. And you worked in Andhra with the smart cards. Sorry. Now, how do you experiment at scale? How do you deliver at scale? Look, all of us, our focus is primarily how to bring all this knowledge, filter all this knowledge, and actually deliver at scale. So I want some answers to that. Yeah.
I think, in some sense, the role of the research and kind of careful analysis of data is really, you can't solve these problems overnight without diagnosing what the problem is correctly, right? So I think the biggest value of the work that's happened in the past 10 or 15 years, high quality research is very, very difficult, right? So it takes time, it takes persistence, it takes sustained effort, it takes technical training. And it's only now, I would say in the past 4 or 5 years, that all of this evidence is starting to change the policy landscape, okay? So I think, there's many questions in what you're saying. And the bottom line seems to be how do we fix this quickly? Okay, and I think the answer is there's no silver bullets. Okay, I'm not going to come here and claim somehow that tomorrow using technology is going to transform our entire education system, because in practice there are no silver bullets. Okay, now these are incredibly complex problems, and so I think the role of research is first and foremost to identify what the binding constraints are. So if I were to synthesize, say, 15 years of research that I did for the 12th five-year plan, that I summarized for the 12th plan, I think the bottom line message is 2 or 3 things. Is that business as usual, okay, is not working, which is the default of the government is to spend more on inputs. And this is not just the Indian government, okay, not to be unfair just to India. This happens world around, okay. So it's much easier for a minister or a bureaucrat to say, I've built so many schools, I've hired so many teachers. So the entire system is focused on inputs, okay? And the headline message number 1 is that the inputs are not correlated with improvements in learning outcomes. Headline message number 2 is that the 2 things that really matter are governance and pedagogy, okay? So if you have interventions that improve the governance and the system, the accountability, that does make a difference. But the other big one is pedagogy, is effective teaching within the classroom. And I think what's nice about the MindSpark is for the first time, we're getting into the black box of understanding the variation in a classroom, understanding how how challenging it is to teach in a setting like that. I mean, this is an incredibly hard problem, right? I mean, I face this at my level. I have a class of 200 students. I mean, there's kids who are bored at the average level. There's kids who are struggling to keep up. Okay, so how do I pitch the instruction appropriately? And this is a problem for every teacher in every classroom anywhere in the world. Okay, so I think. So I think the point about this technology study is it's a proof of concept. I mean, it's a small scale study, like done with about 600 kids, but it is a randomized evaluation. It's extremely high quality evidence that well deployed technology based interventions could be transformative. Okay, so where do we go from here? So let me answer that at two levels. Okay, so one is at a system level, and the second is at the technology level specifically. So at a system level, I mean, in the last year, I have been supporting the Niti Aayog in kind of an honorary advisory role. And one of the things we're trying to do is just try to recognize that to get any system, any bureaucracy delivers what you measure. Okay, so if you measure enrollment, you'll get enrollment. But if you can reorient the system towards learning outcomes, if you can reorient it towards foundational literacy and numeracy, and in the beginning, just independent measurement, right? And document improvements, you're at least moving this aircraft carrier of kind of, of the government system to start thinking about outcomes. So the system level changes we want to make about orienting the macro system towards outcomes.
Professor, sorry, I'll just interrupt you so that you can focus your answer a little more.
Yeah.
Sorry. So let's say you and Amitabh Kant and Rajiv Kumar are in a room together. So what's your escalator pitch to them? You have all this. You have all the data.
So basically, I mean, so it's not just an escalator pitch. It is kind of what we're doing already, right? So what we're doing at NITI is basically two things, right? So the idea of the School Education Quality Index is precisely to kind of say that historically, the central government and social sector has focused much more on centrally sponsored schemes and providing inputs. Okay. Now, what we're trying to do is reorient the conversation towards outcomes, so that we're basically saying that states, we're going to give you. So think about it this way: high-performing organizations anywhere in the world are characterized by autonomy to frontline workers on how do you deliver outcomes, but accountability for delivering outcomes. Okay. In government, we do exactly the opposite, which is you are held accountable for process and micromanaged on process, but not held accountable for outcomes. Okay, so the 10,000-foot reform is changing that focus towards outcomes. Now, there's a second piece of this, which is then how do you scale and how do you deploy effective interventions. And so that's now a lot of what I'm doing with NITI is not even, to be honest, at the center, but it's really supporting states, because that's where the action is in most of the social sector, right? So we're working now with the government of Rajasthan to deploy the MindSpark system in government schools and do a next stage kind of evaluation. So we've done this now at the scale of about 600 kids. The next level is to do this at about 10,000 kids embedded within a government system. So the current study is an out-of-school model where the implementation fidelity was high. Now, the moment to take this within the government system, maybe everything fails because there's no accountability. Okay, so the next step of this.
Now that's where I'll stop you once more. Now, since you're saying the next step is now not just to scale up in terms of number, but also embed it within the government system. So therefore, my next question is, like you said, since you're talking to education secretaries across states, not necessarily at the central level, but at the state level. Now, each state is actually a country masquerading as a state. Okay, so in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, it's about getting more done in the classroom, whereas in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, the education secretary will tell you that it's about getting more teachers in place. So each state will have different issues. So how do you get the public system to deliver?
So that's what I'm saying. Right? I mean, so there are two very different conversations here. Okay, so one is about a specific conversation about where do we take the results from this particular computer-aided learning study and what is the pathway to scale. Okay, and the answer to that question is to say that the current study is a proof of concept, and the next stage is kind of working with governments to say, okay, how are you going to integrate this within the timetable of a given day in a class, in the life of a school. Okay, so that is a level of roll up your sleeves, get your shoes dirty work, that happens with specific states that have shown interest. So in this case, it's Rajasthan, that has the other schools where they have done some consolidation. So they have the scale to have a computer lab. And so that's the specific project going on in Rajasthan about taking the technology itself to scale. Okay. Now, your question right now is a very different question, okay, which is from a policy perspective. Of course, there's thousands of things you can do, okay? And what's top of mind for UP is very different from what's top of mind for Kerala. And And I think at a macro level, the way we are addressing that is that what the School Education Quality Index is doing is it's measuring you over time on improvements and not just on levels. Okay, so the idea here is that we understand that UP and Bihar is starting from a very different place relative to Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So if you look at the levels, I mean, obviously it's different, but eventually the focus is on improvements. And I think the combination of the 14th Finance Commission award, that gives the states a lot more autonomy in how they allocate their spending, and kind of this pivot towards outcomes is going to basically provide states the operational autonomy they need. I mean, frankly, a district in UP is bigger than the median country in the world in terms of population. Okay, so you could take that same argument further down, that what's needed in Western UP is very different from Eastern UP. But I think that's a very different conversation, right? I think, I was focusing the remarks more on the specific scale up of technology, but there is also this macro issue about how do you organize the social sector of outcomes. And I think the answer there is encourage state level innovation, focus on outcomes, document best practices to make it easier to replicate and share of those things. And over time, start tying a little bit of central funding to improvements and outcomes. And so that automatically orients and incentivizes states to innovate and get better outcomes. And so at a center level, it won't be micromanaging what a state does. It'll be getting the rules of the game right so that you focus on outcomes and reward improvements, and then really leave it to the states to figure out what they're going to do and support them technically when they're interested.
Okay, so all this presupposes that these schools, wherever you're doing the study, have computers in place at the absolutely basic level, correct? I'm just going to reach out to my bookshelf. I didn't think of this earlier, but okay, so I have this. So how different is, let's say something like this, okay? So I have a 5th grade maths flashcard and I have a 2nd grade one. Now, since we are talking about basic functional literacy, functional numeracy, which are your favorite words. So now, how different is something like this to what, say, MindSpark does, or what Sal Khan does with Khan Academy? Now, that's in the public domain and it's free. So just for our viewers, if you can explain how any of this is different, then that'll be great.
Fantastic. Yeah. So there's two very good and very different questions there. Okay. So one is, do you need high-end technology in a world when you don't have the hardware? Can you manage with something like the flashcards that you're talking about? And and I think the answer is absolutely yes. That the technology, the fixed costs are expensive, right? And so that's. You have to look at other low-cost solutions, whether it's flashcards or other things, right? I think the point here is, and we say this again and again in the paper, it's not to fetishize technology itself, it's to identify what is the constraint and find the most cost-effective way of alleviating that constraint, okay? Now, and you're absolutely right that in many settings in India, that the technology solution might not even be viable. And so what you would want to focus on is low-tech things, provided that they're able to do the customizing, right? So if you in fact have these flashcards across grades, and if a teacher is able to identify where the kids are and give them appropriate material, then you could do that. Now in practice, that's not happening. Okay, so I think the point of the study in the paper is not so much again to fetishize the technology as much as to document what the fundamental constraint is, which is how wide the variation in a classroom is. And point at the effectiveness of the technology is one way of addressing that. Okay, now the second question you have, which is again broken into two parts. Okay, so the first is comparing across providers, right? And the second is a variant of the first one, which is is this even something we should be thinking about, given that most rural schools are not going to have the technology? Okay, so let me answer the second question first. And the answer there is, if you look at what, say, Nandan Nilekani has been doing with Ekstep in the past 2 years, it's basically taking a bet that with the ubiquitous presence of smartphones, that we're going to be able to leapfrog essentially the desktop computer kind of constraint, and that all of these apps are essentially platform neutral. They can be delivered through computers, smartphones, tablets. And so as the cost of that kind of hardware falls, the distribution channels will become much more accessible. So in that sense, the technology changes very fast and the cost will fall. So I think it makes sense to invest in that. There is a related question, which is a much harder question, okay, which is how do you then compare across providers? Okay, so if you look at the education technology space, there's hundreds of vendors out there, okay? So if you're an education secretary who says, I want to do technology, dealing with the procurement challenge is incredibly hard, okay? So you've got 10 vendors, 20 vendors. I mean, how do you as an education secretary decide, what you're going to procure, okay? And I think the answer is it's an incredibly hard question. And what happens today is two things. One is you end up with a focus on hardware. Okay, so to the government, essentially doing technology in education means school mein computer lab ban gaya kya. Okay, and it's easy because it's a standardized tender. You can do the RFP, you can get 3 competitive quotes, and it is visible. Okay, and you can tell everybody, see, I have built this computer lab. Okay, now what is much harder is then figuring out what is the right learning platform that you need to deploy on that and how to assess whether it's being effective. And I don't have a good solution to this right now, except to say that, a couple of philanthropic organizations, the Central Square Foundation, and we've been talking to a couple of both researchers and funders, is to kind of create an edtech lab, a space where there is public interest research that's done, evaluating a bunch of these platforms. I think Khan Academy is fantastic. I think the fact that it's free is amazing. And yeah, so just the fact that it's free might mean that many governments would default to that, right? Because you don't have to deal with procurement challenges. But there is still challenges about whether it is in fact optimized for Indian conditions. There is a lot of work that they're doing, kind of mapping Indian curricula and standards, and maybe they'll be there in a couple of years. And I would be the happiest person to do a similar randomized control trial. So, in a way, what's important here is that MindSpark is where the results are. So that does not mean that it's only MindSpark. There's tons of other products, but what should be kind of, to the credit of MindSpark is that they were willing to open themselves up to independent evaluation. And most private vendors will not do that because they take a very real risk that we might find that this was not effective, right? So I think they do deserve brownie points, for being willing to be transparent and open up their systems for independent evaluation. But from a public procurement perspective, I would not in any way say that this is the only game in town, and that's a much more complex set of problems.
Yeah. No, I understand. My question was not so much about MindSpark versus Cellcon, but I think again and again, coming back to our Indian audiences living in India and outside, and who have an interest in this, especially say the diaspora who wants to give back. Now, see, the problems are immense. Take Mumbai, for example, just a small example. Okay, last 2 days, there's been heavy rain. Now, I can bet there'll be many schools where you can't even enter the school simply because of waterlogging. It's a simple case. It's a city, the metro city, and it's not even a rural area, but you cannot get to school for, let's say, the next 4 days. Okay, and the teacher wants to finish up something which is left behind. These are finally the aim of all these technologies is it's not whether it's MindSpark or Khan Academy. So can the teacher and the child connect? Can it be evaluated in a fair way? Can you also control for certain issues, like let's say one child is sick, smart kid maybe, or average kid, but that child is sick for a few days. Can these technologies, as learning management software platforms, incorporate all these little things which are fairly realistic in daily life, and ensure that the scoring, the marking, grading, whatever you call it, controls for all? So I think it's a very simple question. It has to be real. It can't be. At the end, I know yours is a study. At the end, it has to provide for all this. There's this movie called Dangal. I don't know if you watched it. Fabulous movie. So there, Amir Khan goes to the school principal, and he says, "Meri beti ke liye, beti ko 2 mahine ka leave chahiye." And then the principal says, if it's for a shadi, it's okay, I'll give it.
I think that was actually for his own leave. I don't think it was for
No. It was for the daughter to train. It was for the daughter to train.
No, I think he was asking for leave from his boss to help his daughter train. So, and he said if it was, anyway, but that's fine. I think the point is, but so again, you see, I think we're confusing 2 very different points here, right? Okay. One is how do you design, how do you modify your assessment systems to be fair and account for the variation in circumstances circumstances, like, of the sort that you were talking about. And the second is completely different, which is like, how do you teach optimally, right? Like, given all of these variations. Okay, now I think my focus right now is pretty much on the second question, right? Like, I think
how do you teach optimally?
How do you teach optimally, right? Like, now the assessment is a much more complex question, and it gets into incredibly complicated issues about, are we assessing for levels? Are we assessing based on improvements? And that gets into incredibly complex social questions because there's disadvantage in every dimension, right? Like, and so, asking for assessment systems to compensate for that is an incredibly difficult, political, ethical, economic question. So I'm going to park that aside for a moment, but let's focus on the actual point about how do you teach effectively, okay? Like, and that I think is a hard enough problem, okay? That in this condition where a school is shut down for 4 days, and then the teacher has to make up the curriculum, and then there's some kids, whose homes may have been washed away, some kids, so given that, so I think again, these are incredibly difficult problems, and we're not going to solve any of them with a silver bullet saying here's a single solution, okay? But I think what a technology-based approach allows is two fundamental improvements, right? One is it allows customization, okay? So if for some reason, like, you are not able to come to class for a week, right? Like, it makes it easier for you to catch up. It's not like the teacher says, "Arey, maine ye portion khatam kar diya," like, now you're on your own, okay? Like, because the software allows you to rewind, it allows you to go faster. You can do 3 hours instead of 1 hour and catch up, and it allows you to do that. Okay, so I think that's one huge advantage. The second is that it accommodates variation across students, and so if you look at, for example, a classroom with so much variation and saying the teacher needs to focus on foundational literacy and numeracy, even if you're in 5th class. Now, the problem then is that the 5th class parent is going to say, like, my child is wasting his time in school, like, because the teacher is focusing only on the kids who've fallen behind. So the question is, again, how do you address that diversity in needs? And the technology offers you one way, like, making progress against that problem. Okay, now, and a big part of, I think, the way forward for the next 5-10 years is how do we reimagine the classroom, like, account for the possibilities of what the technology can do while changing the role of the teacher to be more of a support and a coach, like, and also focusing teacher time on doing things that the technology cannot, right? Like, building social skills, building interpersonal skills, the kind of things that are also increasingly valuable in the workplace. The truth is most jobs are not don't require academic rocket science. Most jobs require the ability to be reliable, the ability to function with peers, the ability to function in social settings. And so the academic piece is one part, and so maybe optimally teacher time should be getting reallocated towards doing those kind of things. And these are all incredibly complex things. And, the classroom has not changed in 100 years. So there's a lot of people who believe that technology will disrupt education, but these things don't move overnight. Okay, so I think we're just at the beginning of a potential revolution. My view on this is that usually the hype is ahead of the substance. Okay, that's why any particular solution needs very careful independent evaluation and research. The fact that we found positive effects does not mean that every technology intervention is going to give you positive effects. I think I would caution your readers and everybody to kind of the one laptop per child experience, right? So here you have very prominent international advocates essentially advocating for how these laptops are going to transform education, and the impact on learning is exactly zero. Okay, so the point is that it's not the hardware, it is how do you alleviate the constraints to teaching and learning, and that's going to take constant iterative design on improvement as well as constant evaluation to make sure that you're being held accountable. So tomorrow, suppose you were to scale this up in public schools, what you would want is not just one independent evaluation, but a continuous process of generating data literally at the keystroke level, right? You now have the ability to use the system data to kind of monitor the progress of every single child. So that's the way in which the way to think about technology is not that it's a silver bullet, but that it expands the feasible set of what you can do. You still need to choose to use it properly to make it deliver on its full potential.
Yeah, and like you said, since your focus is on how to teach better, how to teach more effectively, some of the best teachers are not necessarily the ones with the B.Ed degree, and a lot of research in your own field is about how to reskill or upgrade skills of people who are interested in teaching intuitively. Good teachers, and bring them in somewhere, like they have a, this parallel setup. Well, there's a lot. You want to just wind up with some key messages, which which translate to some tangible lessons from the study and how this might move forward. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I think part of the challenge even in this conversation has been, jumping across from technology per se to larger systemic issues in the education system, right? So let me basically wrap up, on those two notes. On the systematic aspects of the education system, I think the big message is that the default thinking that we spend more and that'll get us improved outcomes, there's no evidence on that. I think, it's really important to just understand that the details matter a lot. It's governance and pedagogy at a macro level. Okay. On this particular study and the way forward, I think the way I see this for parents and for people who are viewing this and thinking, what does this mean for my child? What does this mean for if I want to support education? Is that there is enormous potential in using technology well, but God and the devil are both in the details. Okay. And I think that's a uniform message across all the research and education interventions is that the details really matter. Okay, so if, for example, it's easy to talk about something like, say, PPP. Okay, so is this a silver bullet? I have a student right now who's just finished this incredibly powerful study of a PPP program in Liberia, and what they find is that there's incredible variation across the providers. There's incredible variation across the details of the contract. About so these are incredibly complex problems. The details matter a lot, and that's why research is important. And so for your readers, the other thing I would highlight is that academic researchers are increasingly, I think, doing a good job about synthesizing our work for general audiences, right? So follow me on Twitter. I'll usually link to op-eds, I'll link to public lectures, I'll link to the synthesis and review pieces for people who want to stay on top of what's going on in the education literature.
Since you brought up PPP, I can't help but saying this, that again shows why evidence-based policymaking is so important. PPP projects in many countries, and I'm not going to go and name them, but we know of cases where the PPP exists. The fact that it is tom-tommed, that is also there. And, state governments often use it as something to go and raise money, etc. But on the other side, simple case of, where do you build something? Where do you go and actually invest or start a construction? It should not be where land is available. It should be where the need is there, So PPP...
Anyway, so the reason I'm going to stop you there is
I'm going to stop myself there.
Exactly. It's it's a complete tangent. I think the bottom line is that regardless of what the policy you're being told about, okay, whether it's PPP, whether it's technology, whether it's accountability, whatever it is, the details really, really matter. And there's no getting away from understanding the extent to which, understanding your constraints and understanding specifically the way in which your intervention is going to alleviate those constraints. And I think, that's a big message for anybody designing policies and interventions. And I think for your audience, let me repeat, like you said, evidence-based policy is important, but generating evidence itself is incredibly hard. And so doing high quality research, right, is hard. But for the younger viewers out there, I would say this is a fantastic time to be doing academic economics research. It used to be considered a very theoretical field, but it's an incredibly exciting time and place to both do high quality academic work, that can directly speak to improving policies that affect kind of the welfare of hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be following this work that you do primarily with this, focus that I'd like to see all this research moving towards a place where we can actually get results from the public system. And, just like how, when you say a child is average, what does that average mean? You need to define that far more clearly, all of us. So I'll be following your work. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.